Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and today we're going to do a video where we create a map with Mapbox, but we're going to source our data from this API I have open here. It's some crimes that come from the UK Police Department. They've got latitude and longitude, so we can plot those all over our map. But then we're going to see that even with this amount of data, it's about 1,500 records, the map feels really sluggish. So we're going to use a hook called useSupercluster, which will allow us to cluster these points together on the map. So it will say like there's 10 crimes in this little bubble, and then we'll be able to click into the bubble and it will zoom into the map and expand and break those clusters apart as it's zooming in further and further. So to get started, I have a Create React app that right now is just rendering map. So if we go in here, I've got some imports already done. We'll go over those in a sec. And we've got down here a component called app with just a few comments to guide me along in this video so I don't forget. But right now it's just rendering out here at the bottom a div that says map. So to quickly cover the packages we're using, I will link to the source code below. There's also an article on my website that covers everything in step to step. We'll be using SWR to load remote data. It's a really nice hook. I have a video on that if you're interested in just that. We'll be using React Map GL. This is from Uber, and it's basically a React version to use Mapbox. We'll be using useSupercluster. This is a hook that I made actually, and it allows us to easily use the Supercluster package in React. So to get started with Mapbox, we have to control the state, meaning the map doesn't itself keep track of where the latitude and longitude is, how far it's zoomed in. We have to put all of that into state and then update it as the user moves the map around. So to do that, we will create some state called viewport and set viewport. And it will be use state. So its default value, I put it up here so I don't have to remember it. Let me just copy that. Now I can delete that. So its default value will be the latitude and longitude over I don't know how to pronounce it, Leicester in the UK. I'm from Canada, give me a break. The width and the height of the map itself, so 100 VW, viewport width and viewport height, and then what zoom level it will start on. I'm also going to set up a ref called map ref, and that will be use ref, and it can just start as null, doesn't matter. Later we'll get a ref of the map because we need to access it to gather the bounds of the map, and that'll be used later for the clustering part, but so just leave this for now. So with this setup, why don't we jump down here to where we've got return the map, and we'll replace this div, and let's just get the map rendering first. So we use this React Map GL component. We can put as a comment for ourselves that the markers will be going in here after, but we need to pass some props to this component. So the first prop we're going to pass is actually a bunch of them. We're going to pass all of these, latitude, longitude, width, height, zoom, individually. So we'll destructure them with the triple dot, and that's good to go. Now the map knows sort of where to place itself, the zoom, all of that stuff. Next, I typically set the max zoom so the user doesn't sort of zoom in way too far, like further than we actually want. You could play around with this. It's numbers between 1 and, I don't know, maybe 25 or something like that. The next one we want is this Mapbox API access token. Mapbox doesn't work without an API token, so if you were to run this now, sort of with null in there, you'll see no token warning. So you need to fill this in. You can go to the Mapbox website, create a free account, and grab the token. I've got mine sitting in a .env.local file so that Create React App's loading that up for me. So I access it with process.env.reactapp, and then it's called Mapbox token, like that. So as soon as I fill that in, the map's now rendering. It's over the area I have set it to, but you can see I'm trying to move my mouse. It's not dragging anywhere. It's not zooming. It's not doing anything. So with Mapbox, you need to listen to on viewport change. So this is an event that gets triggered, and what they'll do is they'll give us what the new viewport should be. So we'll have an arrow function here. So whenever this is called, we need to update our state up here. So we'll say set viewport, and we will pass in, let's do a copy of this new viewport. Like that. So with that alone, we should be able to drag the map around now, zoom in, zoom out. So it's starting to come together map-wise. Now, why don't we hop up here and we'll go back to loading data and showing that data as markers on the map. So I already have the URL. It's this URL here, which is an array of crime data. So each crime has a location with latitude and longitude. It's got the type, like antisocial, drugs, bike theft, whatever it is. So we're going to load this and put it into a variable using SWR. So SWR gives us a couple things back. It gives us the data itself, if there's any, and an error. So we use this hook by calling useSWR. And SWR wants a key. This is used by a fetcher function. We'll cover this a little bit, but look at my video for more details. The key in our case will be the URL that we're trying to load data from. Next, we need to pass a fetcher function. This function receives the key and will return a promise that will eventually be resolved to contain our data. So we'll come up here and we'll create this fetcher function. So it's going to take in some args. We don't really care what, so we'll just grab them all, put them into an args variable. In reality, it's just this key here, though, this URL. So we will pass that to the actual fetch function, the one that comes in the browser. And this returns as a promise, and the promise needs to be converted into JSON. So we'll do that right now. And there's our fetcher function. So receive the URL, the key, pass it to fetch, convert that fetch response to JSON. That will return a promise, but use SWR is expecting that. So when it resolves, it will populate our data. And now we can come down here and we need to massage the data a little bit. So why don't we create a variable called crimes? And there's a couple use cases we need to take care of. The first is that there might not be data. So we'll say when data. If there's no data here, it means it's still loading potentially. And there is not an error. So if those two are true, we can access our data. Why don't we just grab the first 100 crimes right now? And if one of those is false, we'll just have no data rather than failing out the map. So we won't notice anything yet on the map because we haven't converted it into markers or anything. Why don't we do that quickly? And so we'll come down here. We'll map our crimes. So crimes.map. So for each crime, we will create a marker. Because we're mapping, we need a key. So that will be crime.id. And inside the marker, why don't we have a button? And inside of the button, we'll have an image. So I have an image here called custody. That's some like handcuffs and prison bars. So .svg. And we'll give it an alt. Crime doesn't pay. Just like that. So I've got a couple classes set up for these markers so they're the right size and whatnot. So let me just pop over here. I need to give it a crime marker class name. Crime marker. Okay. And we need to give it the position, right? The latitude and longitude. So the latitude would be crime.location.latitude. And the longitude is the same. Longitude. Crime.location.longitude. Okay. So if we do just that, we should have some markers on our map. Oh, frig. What's it saying? Invalid attribute, latitude or longitude, something wrong. What could it be? Does it need to be parsed? I think it comes as a string, so maybe that's why. Let's see. What do we got? What do we got? Nice. Cool. So that was it. The data itself has latitude and longitude as a string. Most mapping things want it as an actual float, a number. But here you go. We have 100 crimes on our map. There are all these little handcuffs here. And let's change it now. Instead of 100, let's do 2,000. I think there's only 1,400, so that will grab all of them. And look how crazy this is. And see, I'm trying to like drag the map around. It's like barely moving. You can like barely zoom in. It's really a mess. Like you don't know what's going on. There's 1,500 markers and like a tiny little part on the map. So that's not really useful. It's unusable really. So one solution to this is clustering. So you can see there's sort of big clusters of crimes. We group them all together and we say there's 100 crimes in this cluster. Zoom in further to see it break apart into smaller clusters. So that's what we're doing next. We've got our crimes showing up. We've got some issues because of that. So let's use the useSupercluster hook to cluster the points together. And the first thing we need to do is Supercluster wants the data massaged into its own format. So what we'll do is we will do that right here. So we'll say crimes.map, so each crime, and it is going to return an object like that. So the format of this object, I've got it up here just so that I don't forget. It is a GeoJSON feature object. So it's an actual sort of defined and documented data type. So we've got that here. So what it is, it's an object that says type feature. We can have any sort of properties that we want on it. So these are custom fields that come from our crime that we want to maintain to be able to show to the user later or something like that. So I've set up here that I want it to say cluster false. When we're using clusters, eventually those will say cluster true. So I'll be able to differentiate what's a point, what's an individual crime versus what's a cluster of crimes. I've got our crime ID just so we have a unique ID on this thing. So that would come from crime.id. We've got our category, that would come from crime.category. And then geometry. This is where we pass in the coordinates. And it's longitude first and then latitude. It's important if you mix them up, it's not going to show up correctly. So we've got crime.location.longitude, and then we've got the same thing, .latitude. Okay, so with these points set up in the correct format for Supercluster, why don't we come down here and we'll start to use this get clusters code. So it will return us an object that we can destructure, and it will give us the clusters. So we say use supercluster, and we need to pass in a few things. The first thing we need to pass in are the points that we set up above. So we can just do points like that. The next thing we need to pass in is the current zoom level of the map. So here we can say zoom, and because we've got this stored in state, we can say viewport.zoom. So viewport.zoom will give us that. We need to pass in the bounds of the map. So bounds are basically the four corners in latitude, longitude of what's currently being displayed on the map. So sort of as we move the map around, the bounds will be changing. And to get those, we need basically to access the actual Mapbox map. So we're sort of stuck at this point. So to do that, remember I set up this map ref here? Well, we can come down and we can add a ref. ref to our React Map GL component. So that will give us access to the map itself. So to get the bounds, we will say bounds are equal to, so there's not always a map ref, so we'll say when there is, so .current. Then we can access the current ref, which would be this component here. It gives us a function called getMap. So instead of the component, we're now reaching into the actual Mapbox map. That gives us a function called getBounds. That will give us a function called getArray, which will convert it into sort of an array of arrays. It looks like this, sort of lat, lawn, like that. Whereas the two sort of corners, the northwest and the southeast. But we want it into a flat array of just 4 numbers. So now we can call the flat function, which will flatten that out and basically get rid of these arrays and just give us the 4 numbers like this. So if there is no current ref, because the first render that will be undefined, we can just return null. We don't have bounds at that point. So now that we have our bounds, we can come down here and just use that variable. And the last thing we need to pass to the useSupercluster hook are the options that will be passed on to Supercluster. So I'm going to look at my article because I forget what they are. Radius and max zoom. Cool. So radius, this is sort of how big of the cluster zones we want Supercluster to use. So we can make them use bigger squares or smaller squares. I'll show you what happens when you change that. And then how far we want Supercluster to basically allow the user to zoom into and still produce clusters for. So with that, we're basically set up, and we come down here, and we were mapping crimes before. We're going to tweak this, and we're going to now map the clusters. Maybe we even want to just console.log it so we can see what it looks like. Clusters. I'm going to pop this back to like 200 so that the map isn't very slow. Okay, I messed up something. GetMap, getBounds, getArray is not a function. All right, sorry about that. Let's see what I actually put. GetBounds. GetMap, toArray. That's our issue there. toArray. Sorry about that. Cool. So if we look into our console, so we just go into the developer tools. Hopefully you can't hear my computer. It's freaking out right now. But if we pop open this array of clusters, you can see that instead of what we had 200 markers here, 200 crimes, we've now only got 7 clusters. And a cluster looks very much like the data that we set up here as we mapped all of our crimes to create GeoJSON feature objects for each of them that we call points. So it's a type feature. It's got an ID. That's the ID of the cluster. It's got some properties. So a cluster will say cluster true. That's why we set up this one to say cluster false when we're dealing with individual points. And it will also give us how many points are in each cluster. So this one has 126 crimes or points within it. And then it gives us the geometry, same geometry, longitude, latitude, and an array. So what we're going to do now is basically just show the clusters rather than the markers. So we come down here and we will map the clusters. So that is one cluster. But I'm not going to have an automatic return like I did before. I'm actually going to put an if statement because there's 2 things we need to cater for right now. All right, is that good? There we go. So a cluster could be one of 2 things in this case. It's either a cluster itself, which is a bunch of points together, or as you zoom in far enough, it will actually return us points. So we have to differentiate between these. And we can do that with an if statement. So the first thing we'll do is, why don't we set up some variables? So const, let's get the latitude and longitude first. So longitude, comma, latitude of this thing. So that would be cluster, geometry, and then coordinates, I believe. So then we'll destructure this into two variables. We can also come in here and we'll say, put the cluster into an isCluster variable, like that. And we can say cluster.properties. So with this, we have a variable called isCluster. So we can say, if the thing we're mapping over is a cluster, then we can return a marker that represents that cluster. So I'm going to build another one of these markers. So we need a key. So that would just be the cluster.id in this case. We need to give it latitude. So that's easy. We've got a variable. Same with longitude. Like that. So I'm just going to put a div inside and give it a class name of cluster marker. I've got some styling I can apply to that. And inside of this, what I'm going to do is basically just show the point count. So you remember that each cluster had the number of points that live within it. So we can actually put its point count. We'll put that into a variable like that, just so we don't use the underscores. Not that those really cause any harm, but whatever. So point count. So we're mapping over the clusters. If it represents a cluster, so maybe this variable should be a point or something, but let's go with it. If the cluster is a cluster, we're going to render this marker. Else we'll come down here, and that means we have an individual crime. So what we can do is we can say cluster.properties.crimeID as its key, because we set that up right up here. And then latitude and longitude, we already put those into variables. So latitude and longitude here. Longitude. So let's see what our map's doing. Messing up something. Latitude, invalid prop, longitude of, oh, same issue. So this needs to be parsed before passing it to the coordinates as we're building these feature points for each of the crimes. So now we've got it showing up. So you can see here, we've got, first of all, the map is, well, maybe I'm cheating. I'm only showing 200 now. So why don't we allow it to go back up to 2000? Cool. So you can see here the map's actually moving around, even though we're showing essentially 1500 points on the map. But because we're clustering them, we're actually only showing 7 right now. And as we move in, Supercluster is sort of recalculating what the clusters look like at each zoom level. We keep zooming in, it breaks them apart again. And now you can see that I'm actually starting to get some individual points sprinkled in. So that's where we've got this if statement down here as we're looping over all of them. If it's a cluster, return a marker that just has the cluster. That's the 114, the 6, etc. If that's false, we'll return a marker that represents an individual crime. So that's these crime doesn't pay hands, custody hands. Zoom in further, you get more individual crimes, less clusters of them. And the next thing we're going to do, it's basically working, but it's hard to, 477 is a lot more crimes than this 3 up here. So we're going to dynamically set some width and height on each of the markers so that it looks a little bit different depending how many points are in that cluster. So we'll just do that with style. So we've got width. And we'll start with width. And what we're going to do is, I played around with it to find sort of what works, but we've got 10 pixels plus. So what we'll do is we'll do plus the point count. So how many are in this individual cluster divided by the number of points in total. So that will sort of get us a percentage representation of each of the clusters. And then we'll multiply that by 20. So if it's say 50% times 20, that would be however many pixels that is. So that's setting the width. Now we want to do the same thing for height. Oh, pixels, probably. Cool. Well, we'll figure it out later. So we've got the width. Now we want the height. Cool. So you can see that the 857 now is bigger than the 24. If you wanted it sort of more pronounced, you can just multiply this by more pixels. That'll make it each one a little bit bigger in comparison with the ones with less points. So 50 looks pretty good. The 857 is a big cluster. 191 sort of average, and then you get down to the 36 and it's a lot smaller. So I mentioned above here when we were setting this up, the radius. If we set this to like 25, you'll see that it creates the cluster squares a lot smaller and you get a lot more of them. So that's almost like too many. It's a little bit crazy. So you set it up to 200. Now it's too few. You sort of got very sparse clusters. It's not really useful. So that's why I had it at 75. It was like a nice balance of not too many clusters, but not too far apart. So you can play around with that to find what works best. The next thing we're going to do is show you how to interact with the actual instance of Supercluster. Why would we want to do that? Well, it would be pretty cool if I could click on this 477 and it would sort of zoom the map in to the point where, see, it broke apart from 477 into a bunch of smaller clusters. So the actual Supercluster instance gives us the ability to say, what's the zoom level of the map that would cause this cluster to break apart into smaller ones? And this useSupercluster hook gives us back the actual Supercluster instance. So now we can use that by going down and adding an on-click event. So like that to our div that represents a cluster. So what we'll do is we will first access the zoom level that we need to get to in order to have it break apart. So what we can do is we can call this the expansion zoom. And we'll say that's equal to Supercluster, and it's called get cluster expansion zoom. And you have to pass in a cluster ID. So passing in that cluster ID, it will return us back when does it break apart. Now the problem is if you've got 10 points that are exactly the same latitude and longitude, you basically could zoom in infinity and it's not going to break apart. So we will set a max sort of zoom level we want it to allow us to get to, 20, which is the max zoom of the map that I set up anyways, 20. So that's a good number. Don't zoom in further than we can sort of actually go to. And because we control what the viewport looks like, basically once we have this value, we can just update our viewport. So set viewport, we'll take a copy of our current viewport. Then we can maybe update the map to the latitude and longitude of the cluster. And then the new zoom level, which will be the expansion zoom. So by doing those two things, let's see. Oh, geez. Oh, it's because I said max, right? I want the min. I don't want it to go above 20, so the min of whatever it is. Cool, there we go. So I click that and it zooms in every time, 75, zooms in, 20, zooms in. and it keeps going to the next level when it breaks apart. But it's sort of jarring, like it just sort of, boom, you're now on the new zoom level. Like that. It'd be cool if we could have it sort of transition in, zoom in smoothly with an animation. And we can actually do that pretty easily with Mapbox. There's something called transition, Transition Interpolator. So what we pass to this is something that I imported up here at the top. It's the only one I haven't used yet, Fly to Interpolator. So by passing a new, what's this, 2? I forget what that 2 is. I've got it written down in front of me, but I forget what it is. Let's see. Interpolator. Speed. That's what it was. That's why I take notes, because I can't remember this much code. So how quickly it should zoom in to that spot. And it would be transition duration auto. So we'll let it decide how many milliseconds it should do this transition over. If it's a bigger sort of jump, it will take longer. If it's just a small little jump, it will take less time. So transition duration auto. So by passing these two properties into our viewport state, it will cause Mapbox not to jump immediately, but to zoom in. Not the nicest transition. There we go. It's a little bit better. I think it's just my computer freaking out while I'm recording this video. But, oh, that one's nice. Oh yeah. Boom. Boom. Cool. So that's it. That's working with clusters in Mapbox. Let's just review what we've done, because we've written 120 lines of code in this video. Better to revert to the article I wrote, as I did like 5 times in this, because it's a lot going on. We created a fetcher function so we can use that with useSWR to fetch some remote data. First thing we did was we set up our map, set the default viewport, and a ref that we'll use later to grab the bounds of the map. In the next section, we went and fetched some data. So we used the useSWR hook, stale while revalidate. It uses a cached version of the data while it fetches a new one. It's a really cool package from the folks at Zeit. So we got some data back. We checked that we have data, so it's not loading, there's no error. And we played around with how many records we were going to actually show. With clustering, we could show all sort of 1,500 or whatever there was. Zoom out. 1448, that's what there were. And empty array if there's no data yet. We had to map these crimes to put them into GeoJSON feature objects. And they sort of look like this with custom properties and the geometry where this point is. Remember to parse into a float if your number comes in as a string like mine did. Next, we need to grab the bounds of the map. We never did look at what they look like, so let's just console.log that out. Pop open the dev tools. So it was just an array of numbers, longitude or longitude lat sort of thing. So with our bounds, with our zoom that we keep in state, and with the points that we created, we can now use Supercluster. So we passed it the points, the current zoom, the current bounds, and some options for the instances of Supercluster. And with that, we get an array of clusters back. But remember that clusters could represent one of two things. It could be an actual cluster of points or actual individual points. So we used a variable or called isCluster so that we could check, is it a cluster? If so, show it in a different style. So we have this variable width and height circle showing up. We set our width and our height dynamically so it changes depending on how many points are inside of it. And we showed the point count just in the middle. There's 857 there, etc. We also kept track of an on-click so that we could grab the next zoom level and have it zoom into that location. It's not working great because my computer's struggling to do everything with recording this video and whatnot, but yeah, it works. So down here is basically the else. If it's not a cluster, it means we have an individual point on the map, so that's one crime. So let's show that differently. And as we zoom in and the clusters break apart, we'll get access to more and more details. You can see that even still, this 17 is not breaking apart. That's because there's 17 crimes that happen on this one location. So you'd need to basically, Supercluster provides a way to say, what are all of the points that make up this cluster? So if you click it, maybe you could pop open a box that shows a list of all the crimes in this 17, or on hover or something like that. And that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this video, saw how to render remote markers on a Mapbox map in React, and also how to cluster them together. And then how to transition zoom into it. That's it. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.